is the most important thing we do as a faculty, in my opinion, is in guiding others to join us and to accomplish the things in their career that help you stay mobile, where you can go anywhere you want to go, that because it is wonderful here, a great place, just ignore the weather today, great place, great people, and that hopefully we're doing the things to support you in your efforts, that you will choose to stay. And so part of the promotion and tenure process, the discomfort, the tension, a little bit of what you're doing is a self-imposed tension, and part of it is certainly a part of the process. So the willingness to share is a way to reduce the uncertainty and to increase your ability to maneuver through this process. So I'm really glad that you're here today. Don't be scared, just be powerful, and thank you. I'll turn it over to the Rising Tide Center and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Provost Gilbert. So I think I know most of you all, but welcome. My name is Susan Gardner. I'm the director of the Rising Tide Center in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and we are delighted you're here with us today for our annual event. I'm trying to think, how long have we been doing this now? 12 years, 10, something 12 like years. So we're really excited. And as Dr. Noblet, Associate Professor Noblet here said in the middle, it's kind of a rite of passage for many of us that have been to these events over the years, sometimes several years, listening to others talk about their experiences, and then to be able to sit at this table and talk about your own experiences. And as I said to the table, you know, they're going to be able to sit at the table now as the full professors, because we also do that event every year as well, associate to full. So we're glad you're here. We do want to share with you a couple of the resources that we do offer that are in your packet, as well as some of the resources that we offer on our website, as well as on the Academic Affairs and the Provost website to make you aware of. So a few of those things are in the packet that I want to draw your attention to. If you look on the left side, the green is the green and the purple are some of the different handouts that actually come from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. While a lot of you may not be necessarily from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, I think they've done a wonderful job of really kind of spelling out the process. Dean Haddad is, you know, a kindred spirit, another type A person like me, where, you know, she's really kind of nailed down all the details to make it a lot easier. You know, I think also for herself, because she has so many people going through the process in a given year. So I think they have some great resources there. So even while some of it may not be specific to your discipline, I think the process in terms of the timeline and the format are helpful. So those are there for you. The kind of, what is this color called? Buff. This color handout. This one is an old one. I think this was around in the packet when I came, you know, 12 years ago, 14 years ago. Just some general suggestions for successful applicants. Then there's an essay in here on how to earn tenure. So there's just some general resources on the left side. On the right side are the more specific actual guidelines and formatting handouts. The first one in the salmon color is the latest format. So the University of Maine system has a very specific format that they require that you must use. Not optional, required. Is lovely and is helpful and it is easy to use. I'm being slightly facetious. This is the required format. Okay, so depending on your unit, depending on your college, some colleges are requiring everybody use this pre-tenure. Others are saying you only have to do it in particular years. Make sure you find out what your requirement is. I think there are some colleges now that are asking you to just start going ahead and putting your materials into this format to save yourself a lot of headache later on, because then you're just used to using it. But this is the format. The most recent one, they do update it from year to year. So depending on when you're going up, you'll want to make sure you get the most recent one. The other two handouts in here are one suggestion of how to format your student evaluations of teaching. So there is no standard format per se for this. You do have to have some kind of way that you're going to present it. So this is from the University of Maine system. The pink one is one suggestion. The other one I would say that's more standard here at the University of Maine is this goldenrod colored one. So this is the one you'll often see used here on our campus. But again, there isn't necessarily one right way to do this, and maybe some of our panelists will share that. So these are some of the different things that are utilized. The other thing I wanted to share with you are the fact that all of the promotion and tenure guidelines, if you haven't seen yours yet, you should have, but if you haven't for some reason, they are all available to you on the Provost's website. So if you do umaine.edu/provost, there is a tab there that says, what's the specific name? It's like guidelines, and I think it's departmental evaluation guidelines is the title, and it has every single department, school set of promotion and tenure guidelines. So they are all there for you. So if for some reason you haven't gotten them, step one, I'd probably go talk to your chair or director because you should have been given them. But two, if for some reason you haven't seen them, they are there. Okay. The other thing I would share with you is that we have available on our website, so umaine.edu/risingtide, all one word, we have packets of people who've recently gone up for promotion and tenure. So that's really helpful to see how other people have kind of, put together their narratives for some of these different parts of the packets. What do they look like when they're put together? Again, they're not going to be necessarily from your specific department, perhaps, or your specific college, but just to see what a packet looks like. Because some of us might be in units where maybe there hasn't been anybody who's gone up for tenure in a while. I know that was true when I went up for tenure years and years and years ago. So it was helpful to just kind of see what one looks like. So those are there for you, both for people going up for tenure, but also for people going up for full. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Okay? So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. And I'm not going to go into great detail because I think they'll get a chance to introduce themselves here, and tell a little bit about themselves and maybe a little bit about their journey. But I'm very excited that we have, starting at the end, so here we have alphabetical order, here we don't necessarily have that alphabetical order, so I'm going to introduce to you what we have on our table up here. We have Dr. Kristy Townsend, down at the far end, Associate Professor of Neurobiology. Next to her is Dr. Mette, Associate Professor of Educational Leadership. Here in the middle is Dr. Caroline Noblet, Associate Professor of Economics. Next to Caroline is Dr. Will Gramlich, Associate Professor of Chemistry. And next to me here is Dr. Elizabeth Neiman, Associate Professor of English and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And so I prepared some standard questions that we have actually every year. And I'm going to let the panel kind of go loose with these questions. But the questions that we are asking them is, one, was there anything different or unique about your tenure process, or was it quote-unquote typical? Two, what are some best practices or tips you might have for those preparing their applications or dossiers? And then finally, what do you wish you had known before starting the process? So with that, I'm going to sit down and turn it over to our distinguished panelists.
I've got a tiny post-it so I can be succinct. So I'm Kristy Townsend. I'm in School of Biology and Ecology, and I guess the couple of things that were different about my tenure process, I got a year credited, and so if anyone has a year or any more than that credited, that was a little bit confusing to me, and I guess it really doesn't get added on until you go up for tenure, and they don't count it or look at it until that point. And I'm 50-50 research and teaching, so that's really what I prioritized and focused on in my tenure packet, although I did service and reported that, but it wasn't part of my appointment. So my little tidbits of advice that I wrote down, first of all, in talking to my colleagues, so I'm a biomedical researcher and a lot of my colleagues are at like big med schools and things like that, UMaine really is supportive, and we do want all of our faculty to get tenure from most of what I understand. So it is relatively easy here if you do what you need to do to get tenure, so I think that helps relieve some stress in the process, and usually departments are supportive of their junior faculty to make sure they get to that point. So one thing I made sure to do is keep a list of things to add, like you might keep a list of things to add to your CV. I kept a list of things to add to my reappointment packages every year, and then obviously that led to a tenure packet, because you end up doing a lot of things, especially service, I feel like, and you forget that you did it, or you gave a talk at a meeting and forget that you did it, so keeping a list I think is good. When I was putting together my tenure packet, I got examples from 3 colleagues who had just gone up the year before, one in my department, and 2 in other departments. But I should say that my department's pretty broad, and there aren't many people who do what I do in my department. So even the example I got from my department was someone who does science education research, and so it was pretty different from what I do. But those were helpful because I tend to write paragraphs of things, but I was advised that peer committee and also up above, they prefer in a lot of sections for you to bullet point or make numerical lists instead of write long prose. And especially they like things quantified. So to actually say, like, I brought in this amount of grant funding, I published this many papers, I mentored this many students, like actually quantify things, that's helpful for reviewers. And speaking of departmental differences, in talking to colleagues in other departments, I realized how different the process really is, especially for reappointment, but even for the final tenure submission to the peer committee, it's different from department to department. When deadlines are, like saying who you want your letter writers to be, those deadlines are very different. And in our department, we had a format, for our reappointment that was completely different than the UMaine format that we needed for tenure, and I figured that out probably a little too late and had to scramble and get it back in the right format. So pay attention to that. Let's see. Oh, I found that the teaching data was the hardest part to do, and I wished I had done more of that during my reappointments and not just for my tenure packet. That took a lot of time. Especially if you teach bigger classes, it's just a lot of data to assemble and typing in all the student comments by hand, although I guess everything's digital now for evaluation, so it might be a little easier, but I think that was the biggest time suck. And then for my number 3 thing, and then I'll hand it off, the thing I wish I knew before I started might be specific to me, but I thought I'd share it in case it's useful to anybody else. When you list potential external letter writers, you can apparently list anyone that you would want to exclude, and I did not know that. In my field, we, in biomedical research, is very competitive. We can get scooped. We're very careful with our data and our ideas before it's published. And my tenure packet got sent to my biggest competitor. Wrote me a very nice letter, but when I saw that he was sent my packet with all my research program and everything that we had been doing unpublished, I nearly passed out. And I didn't find out till afterward that I could have requested that person to be withheld. So a little bit of advice. I don't know how relevant that is. Not every field you have to worry about that, but that's my wish I knew ahead of time one.
Thank you.
Do you want to just go online?
Sure.
All right.
I'll try to make it quick. So my name is Mette. Again, I'm in educational leadership. And I think my case was pretty typical. I guess it's unusual in the sense I did work at 2 previous institutions. So my wife and I are academic partners, and so we were at University of Wyoming for a year and then University of Arkansas for a year before we came here. So we sort of just joked that we got to see a broad array of different things throughout the country before we came here. But I think other than that, it was a pretty typical experience. Just some best practice tips that I wrote down, and sort of echoing, I think, what everyone will probably say. I would strongly encourage you to just sort of continually to update your CV. I do that every single time I log new service, every time I have an update on a publication, whether it's accepted, revised, resubmit, whatever. And my teaching evaluations, I do the same thing. So that just helps you not have to have the rush at the end. It's sort of picky up front, but it will really save you time at the end. You're trying to make the argument on paper that you have a national reputation, right? And you're trying to argue the value that you bring to University of Maine, but then also on a national level. So within that argument, I think just trying to find as much synergy as you can between your teaching, your research, and your service is critical. It will prevent burnout for you, but it will provide additional points of contact for you as well. I do think as you prepare your application, you should be using the university materials. For me, they were vastly different than what I was asked to do at the college level. And I started doing that essentially at what the equivalent would be of year 3 for me. And that really helped prepare me for the final submission. I think you probably need a couple years of trying to figure out what they're asking you to write down on paper and how you can update that so it's as strong as possible. I did also have a mentor who offered to go through this with me. So John Shemwell offered to do that. He ended up leaving, going to another institution, but that was really helpful for me. He was able to share what went well for him and how I could improve my packet. Just as someone that's brought in additional years of experience, if you are, I would start having conversations with your peer committee and probably your supervisor, so either your chair or your school director sooner rather than later. I think it's really important, and I learned, great mentor myself, you need a signal to your committee whether you think you're ready to use those years and whether they think you're ready to use those years. And that signaling strategy can be really important because then it's documented in your letters that you think that you might use these years of experience, but that you reserve the right until the very end to use those. And that's a little bit different with our updated contract now that we have with AFM. I actually think you can, if you pull your application, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you pull your application at the provost level, you can still go up the next year. Is that true or no?
I'm too new to know,
Okay.
but I'll check on that. I don't even know.
There's
that I have a
updated
question.
language that you would want to look into in the
Yeah.
AFM contract. But regardless, signaling to your committee and your direct supervisor would be really important. Another thing that I did is strategically think about who I'd want my letter writers to be. So that included not publishing with people that I knew I wanted or to be considered for letter writers. I actually turned down 2 opportunities to write book chapters with people who ended up being people that were submitted as letter writers. And while I missed out on that publishing opportunity, I felt that paid dividends on the other end when they did write letters. And while you can't directly ask someone to be a letter writer for you, I believe that's discouraged. There's nothing saying that you can't network with people at national conferences and connect with people about your expertise, and then you sort of let your work, sort of do show your value and why they might write a letter for you. I think the only other thing that maybe I'd share, I had some other things written down here that I wish I had known before starting the process. UMaine is a great place to work, and you can actually be creative in a lot of different ways that you might not be able to at other institutions. So, you're in theory, you're going to be in this profession for 30 to 40 years, right? You have a lot of time to explore different lines of inquiry. So I think just encouraging you to think creatively about how you can apply your work will help you continue to love your job that you do every day. So for example, thinking creatively about new programs that you might offer. For some fields of study, those are pretty set. In others, you can sort of blow the door off the hinges, and you can think differently about different ways that you might serve Maine and through different programs. So we relaunched an EDD program in Ed Leadership, and it's been wildly successful. It's been much more successful than programs that we've offered in the past. You can think creatively about the ways that you want to disseminate your research. I started an online open access journal, which some people sort of poo-poo, but I did that at the University of Maine, and that's actually helped propel us in an area of research that I conduct. We're now a national leader in that area because of that journal. So that's really important to think creatively about how you disseminate your research. And then I think just being creative about how you want to spend your time in service and how that helps make the world a better place. We really have this position of privilege, and how we leverage that privilege I think is really important. So those were some things I thought I should share.
Hi, I'm Caroline Noblet from the School of Economics, and so my unique case is this. I was a non-tenure track lecturer for 7 years here at the University of Maine before getting a tenure track position. And so I, perhaps of all the people on this panel, have been thinking about getting tenure here at the University of Maine the longest. So forgive me if some of my comments are a little lengthy. So Susie and I actually came in the same faculty class. When she said she's been here for 12, 14 years, so have I, but I just got tenure. So, and if anyone is in that position, feel free to come talk to me. Like, I'm happy to talk to anybody who's a lecturer now and think you're going to get transitioned or are transitioned, any of that. There was certainly some lessons learned that I'm happy to share. Because for the 4 years probably before I actually got a tenure track position, my yearly appointment letter said her work is consistent with someone that would be preparing to go up for tenure, like for years. But I'm married to one of our business administrators, so here we are. Anyway, so that's my unique case. Happy to talk about it. Okay, So here's what I would say. Everybody's mentioned how important your external letter writer list is, and I think that for most of us, that's the scariest part, because it's the part that we have the least control over, right? Like, we can work, we know how to publish, we know how to do that, right? We know how to do research. These are things we can control. But this idea of this like nebulous external letter writers is scary. So here's just some hints from good old experienced me. First of all, have some conversations with people in your department about their preferences. So I can speak for my department specifically that my department would prefer to see a letter writer who is also at another land-grant institution, right? That would be a great hit. Someone who's a full professor, and someone who, you know, is in the same area you are. So I'm a behavioral environmental economist. Yes, that exists. And so I was able to get someone who was the director for the Center for Behavioral Economics, right? That's a direct match. But ask your department, because there may be other preferences that people have in terms of what they want, right? Associate professors are allowed to write letters. I had some people willing to do that for me too, but the sort of big hits were the ones that were land grant full professors specific in my discipline. So ask your departments. The other thing that I would say is actually start that list now about who you're thinking about. So to Kristy's very well taken point, have the no-no list too. But some of you, especially if you're new, might be sitting here thinking like, how do I even start that list? And the part that worked for me, and I guess I would make that suggestion for all of you, by all means, go to the big national conferences. But if you guys are any, like, you know, if you're in the same boat I am, my national conference could have like 8,000 people at it, right? It can be enormous. So what I would recommend is if there's a something within your discipline, or if there's a regional, so we're really lucky, we have a regional group that's New England and a couple provinces in Canada, that is a great smaller group of people, and many of my letter writers were from that group. I went every year to that same small conference. I got involved in that conference. Pay attention. Who's the president of that? Who's going to be the president the next year? Because a lot of places you know, right? So I paid attention, and a gentleman who I really wanted to have write me a letter was up for president. And when you're the president of our organization, you organize the conference with someone who's the conference chair. Guess who volunteered to be the conference chair that year? This gal. And indeed, he was kind enough to write a letter, right? So yes, they want to know your work, but it's easy for people to say no, right? Let's just be honest with ourselves. It's easy to get an email. Will you write a letter for Ian? I mean, Ian's work is great and all that. I really don't, you know, no. It's if they know you personally, like not co-authors, because I did the same thing. I too thought strategically about who I wanted my letter writer list to be, and a lot of people will be good about it. I had a conversation with a gentleman that I consider like a professional mentor now, a few years ago. He was like, hey, do you want to, you know, work on a paper together? And I was like, I am so truly flattered, but I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to go up for tenure in 2 years. I'd love to be able to put you on that list, and I can't if we co-author together. And he said, that's really smart of you. Like, that's really strategic. He's like, that totally works for me. He's like, I'll see you at our conference next year, right? Like, he understood. To a great point that Kristy said earlier about preparing, this is under the best practices kind of thing, preparing your stuff. Charts are also really helpful. So charts and bullet points, right? Your letter writers are busy people. What our department does, and I'm just going to throw this out there as maybe a helpful thing, we create a Google Drive. And on the Google Drive, you have your narrative, you have your teaching evals, you have all your publications, you have your CV, you sort of put everything on this Google Drive, and then that Google Drive gets shared with your external letter writers. So it's like, there it is. So if you even start building a Google Drive right now, throw your pubs on there, right? Throw some of your teaching evals on there. It's a great way to get organized. I will say that the form that you guys were all given today has been known to change more regularly than you might be prepared for, so just keep your eye on it. It's definitely known to change. The other thing I would say that was a point that I was unclear on, wish that I had known, so I guess number 3, there's a couple things I wish I'd known. this is something to clarify with your departments. My understanding is that when you request a letter, those letters, all of them that come in, get part of your tenure package. Yes, you get to choose the 3 that go to the Board of Trustees, but if a letter comes in, it is part of your tenure package all the way up through the Provost's office, through the President's office. I have had other colleagues who thought that if a letter came in and it was super duper negative and was an anomaly, if you will, right, if all their other letters are positive, that their department could make the decision to not include it in their tenure package, but I actually don't think that's true. So I think, right, so clarify that with your department. So that's one thing. The other thing that I wish I had known or wish I had talked about, and these guys talked a little bit about this, even though I was here for 7 years previously, I did not get any time served. And so I constantly was talking with people about the possibility of going up early. There are some units, there are some colleges that just discourage that. It doesn't matter, like this is different, they had time served, right? I did not. Just have those conversations, right? I thought that that would be a good thing for me. It turns out that that was not encouraged by just sort of administration, and it worked out great because that whole thing with the conference chair and that guy writing me a letter, it was perfect. His timing was perfect. But I just wish that like those conversations had happened. The other thing that I wish I had known in going up for tenure is that you don't have to sacrifice your whole life to go up for tenure. I gained 20 pounds, you guys, 20 pounds. Don't do that. There. I think that's my entire list. Will.
Okay. Gained 20 pounds. Maybe I lost some because of stress. So yeah, so
it's gonna go either way.
It's either way, right? So I would say probably. So in terms of point 1 there, I would say my tenure process was probably fairly standard. I came in, had a postdoc. I'm in the Department of Chemistry, by the way, I guess. And I mostly deal with research, with some teaching aspects. I actually have a 75% appointment in research and 25% in teaching with service. That's a good thing to do because you're supposed to do it. And so one, that's sort of a unique case there. But 2, I came in, had 5 years to get tenure, right? Probably the unique aspect of mine was that no one had been successful at getting tenure for various reasons in my department for about 15 years, right? So I was the first person to go up for tenure in about 15 years, which might not actually be that strange in many departments here on this campus, right? So, but it was about that time frame. So when I was going up for tenure, it was a learning process for me, and it was a learning process for the rest of my department, because a lot of them didn't really remember how this whole thing worked and what to do there, right? And so, I in terms of make examples of what you would have for going up in chemistry, I didn't have any examples. I created the example, and those types of things. And so, if you're in a situation like that, I'm happy to talk to you and give you stuff. Out as best as terms of somebody in the sciences would be in terms of and remember folks in the sciences have different focuses and folks in other disciplines as well. So that was kind of the unique aspect of mine, I would say, is that there was very little institutional knowledge at that time because it had been so long. And so the other aspect I would echo is use the form that you would use to go for tenure and keep updating it as you go. That is incredibly helpful, right? It saves you so much time, right? Time is the one resource that you don't have enough of, right? And so anything you can do to save time, do that. So I will echo that aspect of that. What are the unique things about it? Yeah, best practices. So the letter writer comments, I'll echo some of these things. You don't have to. I was able to find a bunch of letter writers, and I wasn't any conference chair or co-chair or anything like that. I just went to conferences and met people and talked to them briefly, so that I'm not very good at the whole interacting with people on a face-to-face basis at times and making those types of connections. And so I went and I talked to folks and so they at least know, hey, there's a guy up in Maine that does work in polymer chemistry, and so maybe someday they might get a request to write a letter for me. And that's mostly, if you go to conferences, if you give talks at conferences, if your discipline has really small conferences, I recommend going to those. If you're in the sciences, like Gordon conferences are good examples of, they're small, you meet people, and they'll remember you. And that's mostly what you're hoping for, right, is to find folks kind of in your field. I was, since it had been a while since anybody got tenure, no one knew who to get who were the appropriate letter writers from, so I got letter writers from associate professors, I got full professors, all over the place. And you can, really the important thing to do is to talk to your members of your peer committee. And all departments have different peer committees. Some departments it's everybody that's above you, some people it's but sometimes they change over time, which is odd. But talk to your peer committee. Find out what they're thinking about, right? Because what happens is they're the ones that write your reappointment letters, right? And so this is important to remember. When they write those reappointment letters, they'll say things in those reappointment letters. This so-and-so should do this. It'd be good if so-and-so does this. Those are things you should do, right? Those are the things you should do. And in those sort of signals that they give in those letters, right, though you should look at that. And so it's important, like if you get that letter and you look at the letter and that everything's good, but they have these things you should do, you should go talk to people and figure out what exactly this means, right? Because those are the important aspects actually in those letters for you to kind of pay attention to in there. Sometimes in those letters, it might be, you might notice that some of it comes up from a part of, a lack of knowledge from your peers in your peer community about your field, right? That's actually very, we're at UMaine, right? And so you're probably the expert in your department on that thing, right? And so no one actually knows, you know the most about your department and about that subject matter, and maybe everybody else in your peer committee doesn't. And so there's a lot of education you have to do for your peer committee, at least I found, in terms of things. You have to educate your peer committee through talking to them, and also how you write your reappointment and your tenure aspects. And so, bullet point lists are good. I would say what I eventually found that I had to do is to get it across to my peer committee, with the important aspects were to have essentially a header, headline of what it is that this section's all about and why it's important, right? This is the dollars I brought in, these are the pubs I have, these are the students I've mentored. Have that there at the beginning of each section for those sections in your dossier you put forward. It makes it very clear to them, it makes it very easy for people to see what it is that's really important, and so it makes it quicker. What do you wish you had known before starting the process? So I think people touched on a lot of good things. I would say one of the things I wish I had known before I started the process is actually just how frustrating it would be. I'm sorry, I'm going to make it very blunt. It's incredibly frustrating, I'm sorry, right? It's an incredibly frustrating process, right? And it seems at times because you're getting judged, right? And I think that's, you're doing all this hard work and you're getting judged, right? And I think if you're aware of the fact that it's going to be frustrating, right, and just realize that's part of the process, it might help you, get through it a little bit easier. And realize that, yes, it's challenging, that people are judging you, but people, I have found that UMaine are very supportive, right? And so if you talk to your colleagues about things and get clarifications on stuff, they'll usually help you in that process, and it helps deal with that sort of frustration there, because then okay, they said that thing, I understand what they mean by that now, in my letter, reappointment letters, right? So look at those, so that when you go up for tenure, you've kind of addressed those comments they have, and there's no surprises there. So, in terms of that, I think that's what I have so far.
I have a bit of a cold, so I'm going to try to. I apologize. Can you hear me back there? I'm Elizabeth Neiman. I am the only member of this group who has a joint appointment in English and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And while this isn't necessarily unique as a tenure case, what seems to me unique in terms of the group is that in my field, we tend not to have as many multiple co-authored publications, but we tend to publish books. And so I thought that might be a useful perspective to bring. Also, as a joint appointment, I did have competing expectations for what I was expected to do. Potentially, I had two departments that I was, producing service for, that I was doing teaching for. My training is as a British romanticist, and so I also had a learning curve with the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and the kind of courses that I was teaching. And so a challenge for me was learning how to use those teaching experiences, for in ways that might enrich my own thinking and my own research, and finding ways to speak to both of those in my tenure packet. And, I think I also started at UMaine as a lecturer prior to having a tenure track position, although I was here for fewer years than Caroline. And I do think in my case as well, like I have definitely reflected on the fact that if I had started as a joint appointment without knowing anybody at UMaine, I think it would have been a lot more overwhelming. I did know people in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies department, and I did know people in the English department. And so I had a good sense of maybe who I might be able to say no to. And that really strikes me as important in terms of service. Really, so to apply my relatively unique position to just generally the question of service, I think really being able to think carefully and strategically about what service opportunities excite you, and that you might be able to get invested in, and that might in turn enrich your own scholarship is helpful. There were times that I had to say no, and then there were places and times that I said yes that I was able to build on, to build relationships and collaborations and conversations with different people at the university. Something also people haven't spoken a lot about either is the tensions and pressures of family. I became a mother twice in the process, and I also lost my mother as well to cancer. And so there were a lot of family things, going on for me over this process. And there were, in terms of what you were saying with frustration, there were losses and challenges. I had to cut certain things from my life in order to make it work. And, I want to say that I think it's really important to keep a sense of excitement, as other people have spoken to, and really try to, think about how you can become a better person, through the kind of work you're doing. But also you have to recognize that sometimes the choices you have to make are going to make you actually feel like a worse person. Seriously, sometimes you're going to have to do things. Like I loved how you spoke about the privilege of being here and having this kind of position. But there's a sort of insularity I found too to the process that at times is really disheartening. I had to close my office door a whole lot, and so I think a lot of us, we come here wanting to talk to people, wanting to be in conversations, wanting to have colleagues, wanting to develop networks, and you have to close your door a lot in order to get the work done. And in my field, in English, our appointment is officially 25% research, 75% teaching. But I think that the research that we're expected to do is pretty close to probably what other folks have to do. So what that means is that you have to do it, late at night or early in the morning or on the weekends or over the summer, and we don't get paid. We don't get summer salary in the humanities and in CLAS generally. So I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this before. And so while I feel immensely privileged to have my position and always have been really grateful for it, I was also aware that there was, some challenges there with a particular appointment and the research that was expected, especially in a department where there's not really clear guidelines for what was absolutely expected for tenure. So that brings me to point 3, what you wish you knew before starting the process. I found the letters that we received every year to be immensely helpful, being that they were so transparent. As you were saying, Will, you always knew what you needed to do next. But yet I would encourage you not to get too focused on the letters year by year and to do things that you wouldn't necessarily do just for that letter, but rather to focus on the long-term goal, in my case, which was a book. And I did start a completely new research project at one point and did produce an article from that. So I had ultimately at the end 2 peer-reviewed articles and a book. And in my department, it was generally presumed that you needed either a single authored article each year or a book. But again, there was no totally concise kind of plan. So it was a bit of a risk to start something totally new and different, but I didn't want to put all my eggs in one basket. And in my case, the risk paid off. I was able to get the article done as well as the book. Getting the article done made me, feel more confident at year 3, where I could say, look, I just did this new article. Here, see it, it's done, it's published. That said, if I wouldn't have gotten the book done, it would have, I wouldn't have had a strong tenure case and likely wouldn't have made it. So I think really trying to keep a long view, understanding what's expected in your field, which in my case, in romanticism, really is a monograph, which generally builds on a dissertation, but also really takes that dissertation in new directions. Certainly recognizing the value of those letters, but also, recognizing that different scholars in your department may not have had the same kind of expectations when they went up for tenure that you do, or they may have a different kind of field and different experiences. I would definitely reiterate many of the things said about the form. As somebody though who, as I said, has a 75% teaching expectation, I think it was incredibly beneficial for me to be able to pitch classes and teach classes that really engaged me in issues that related to my research. I learned a lot from my students, and I learned a lot from teaching those classes, and I was able to speak about that relationship in my work. And I think also too, really working early on to be thoughtful and reflective for yourself about your scholarship and like the larger questions that are orienting it, and kind of thinking about that early on and doing some writing about that is helpful for you when you try to think about how you're going to discuss your own research to your department, and also to people in your college, and also people at the larger university. When they read your material, they're going to want to see a narrative that they understand. Also thinking carefully about your teaching, and the practices that inform it, and really get into the habit of doing some writing and thinking about that, so that it doesn't all come as a surprise at the end where you're trying to think about, well, why do I teach this way? What can I say about my teaching? And even if you don't have a 75% teaching appointment, we do value teaching, obviously, at this, land grant university. So really thinking about that carefully. And yeah, I think that would be primarily it, just based on what everyone else said. I think that would be what I would want to add.
So I know that a couple of you talked about bringing years in. I know that you also stopped the clock.
I did.
And
I didn't end up using it though.
Do you want to just talk about that process
Sure.
too, just because that might interest some folks here?
Yeah. So when I had my son 2 years ago, I did put forward the paperwork to stop the clock, and I was assured that I would not have to take that year if I didn't need it. But it was certainly reassuring to know that I could. And that was the year that I finished my book, and it was the year prior to when I went up for tenure. But in that time period when I was pregnant, trying to finish my book, it was a great relief to know that I could have that extra year if need be. And then I was also very grateful that I didn't need to take it when ultimately I didn't feel like I needed it. So I found it to be a transparent policy, but the key point that I think everybody should know is that you always are welcome to stop that clock, but that you are not obliged to do so when the time comes.
I thought of two quick things when Will was talking. About educating the peer committee. I think it's really important, especially if you have a department where there's lots of different disciplines, to explain how the publication author list works, because in some fields, if you're first, you're lead author, if you're last. So I did that. I explained how publications typically are, and that we collaborate a lot, and usually there's a lot of authors, and that's how biomedical works, and not all fields are like that. Another tip I got from someone at another institution, if you're trying to come up with names for letter writers, is to look at people who cite your work, because they might, think that you're doing great stuff, but not have a conflict as a collaborator. So,
one other thing that I think a lot of us face too is in addition to working with undergraduate students, working with graduate students, and that balance of like the time that you give to them as contributors to your research and to their education and learning, and sort of the time that you're spending on sort of your own research, and again, sort of in terms of educating the peer committee and your letter writers. Disciplines are different, but some disciplines are like, wow, you have a paper where the graduate student is first author, but like, that means you put a lot of time and effort into that student to get them where they are. So just, myself and another colleague of mine at different times, both pre-tenure, won the Graduate Student Mentoring Award. And one of our senior faculty members, in fun, but still gonna hurt a little bit, said to us, well, I guess this means you were misallocating your time, right? That like if you won the Graduate Student Mentoring Award, that, so it's just a balancing act, and it's something to think about, that that they're important too, right? The teaching is important too, and we lose sight of that, but and a lot of times you can be honest with your grad students. I used to have a sign that it was a little diagram, and it said, do you want Caroline to get tenure? And there was a line to yes, and there was a line to no. And if you followed the no line, it said, ouch, come in and give me service assignments. If you followed the yes line, it branched again. One time the branch said like, but my question is really important. And it said, proceed with chocolate. And then if the other one, and then the other one was sort of like, my question can wait, so I said, come back when the door is open. So I was communicating to my students and my colleagues in a fun way that like, this is why I needed to close my door, right? But at the same time, sort of saying, I do understand that sometimes students really do have important questions. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yeah, and I think that's all very discipline specific, right? Because kind of in sort of a lot of sciences as well, the graduate students are your engine for getting your pubs out the door and your scholarship, right? Those graduate students are in fact, if your graduate students aren't the top, they're not running very well, that actually can hurt you quite a bit. It makes things challenging, right? So I mean, I would say, that's kind of the thing in fields around mine where it's like your graduate students, they are incredibly important. At least that's what I found. And I don't know, everybody's at different stages, right? But like starting out your lab and spending as much time as possible with graduate students is actually, for like some of the sciences is incredibly important and spends a ton of time. And if you're in a department or school where it's that varies quite a bit in terms of those disciplines, you really have to educate your peer committee on that in terms of those things.
So let's open it up to questions from you all for the panelists. Zach.
Thanks, Susan. I wanted to continue on the comment that you started to make in reference to Elizabeth's tenure clock. One, a comment. I stopped the tenure clock this year for my son born in April. And there was some I was confused about it because the language in the Apple contract says that you should submit the document before September 1st on the year in which the extension applies. I'm not sure what that means. If the extension applies in the year that the event occurs, the birth of the child, or the extension applies the year that you would go for tenure. No one had a very clear answer, but I was told that there's new language in the new contract to iron out that ambiguity. So if that's going to apply to you or applies to you this year, I guess take a look. But my question is related to that, and also, Ian, I don't think you said explicitly whether you came in with years credited. Kristy, you said you did. I came in with a couple years credited, and I'm kind of wondering about how you made a decision whether to use those years or not. What were the factors that contributed to your decision making?
Yeah, mine was written in as optional in my offer letter too, but I used it because of like cues from peer committee basically that I was productive enough that even without it, I would be fine. Because it really doesn't get counted until you go up. Like they don't look at your productivity during that, credited time until the very end. So it really was peer committee support.
Yeah, I just would echo the same thing.
Was your only criterion kind of, does it look like my case is good, or were there other factors?
I wanted my time at UMaine to stand alone because in your reappointment time, they're really only looking at what you did here.
Right.
And then if that can stand on its own, plus you're adding in, well, look, I was also productive right before I came here, and it all together is a good package. I think for me, that's the benchmark.
I have a question. At my previous university, I was encouraged to keep kind of spontaneous notes from students about my teaching. Is that something you guys would recommend doing here for an tenure package, or would it be considered like fluffy?
I think it's not, so in the section with the student teaching evaluations, you have to give the quantitative numbers. But then there is a section to put in comments from students, and you can include those comments however you wish, like if it's about a specific class or if it's just about you as a mentor. I think that certainly it can't hurt,
That reminds me though that, with those evaluations, the only comments that you can use are those that are signed.
Yeah.
So and you're not supposed to have, you can have unsolicited letters as part of your material.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that like an email, because I've had that too, where, oh gosh, what a lovely email from a student. I don't think you can officially use that. But
Not
you,
in your
not
teaching
in your
part, but there's
teaching
part,
part.
exactly, where it says unsolicited student feedback, that's where you can put it.
even if it's before your
I
grading.
have all teachers, they tend
Yes.
to send thank you notes at the end of every semester. So I didn't know if things like that, if it would be okay to include.
I always have, yeah. Yeah, I think especially under advising, that would be a great place to put it.
For my advisees too.
Yeah, so wouldn't go under evaluations of teaching because those have to be those signed comments, but in those other places you could.
Sort of to that point though, I just always say if you're going to complete the evaluation and you want this to go on my record, you can sign and then I can use it.
Yeah.
So I'm not persuading them to, but I'm saying if you're going to, you can sign and that will help my case. And most students end up doing that.
And in relation, you know, now that everything is electronic, I would recommend that you use class time to have them fill out the evaluation so that you really make sure that they are doing it. I had a really high exchange return rate when I did that, in contrast to some colleagues in my department who didn't have as many, you know, responses when they just said, oh, just do it on your own time. So I would definitely create space.
I agree.
The online format of the set evaluation questions is, when you teach an online class, makes it challenging. Even with reminders and reminders, I'm finding that my return rate isn't as nearly as high. It's
frustrating.
And I think the more, I mean, there's enough research out there that talks about kind of the priming you can do as the instructor, even online formats where you can tell them what they're used for, you know, using student feedback earlier in the semester also. So if you're gathering, for example, in my classes, I usually do collect student feedback around week 4, so after the drop period, where I just say what's going well so far, what are suggestions for improvement. I report back to them about that feedback. I do it again at mid-semester. So I'm showing them that I use their feedback. So I notice then that my response rates are higher because they notice that I care about their feedback and I, give that back to them. And then if you let them know this is how this feedback is used, I use it in my teaching, I use it when I'm going to teach again, it's also used in my personnel file. So the more you can kind of prime that for them, there's research that shows that response rates will go up.
And I remind them,
Mm-hmm.
it's just some of, when you're not face to face sometimes.
It is hard.
And you're gonna get the tails, right? The people who love you, the people who hate you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm similar to Susie. I do the same thing where I also, I teach an online class right now, which is a kind of a first for me with a big class. I've even mentioned in my lecture something along the lines of like, in previous years with this class we did X, but based on feedback from students in those previous years, now we're gonna do Y. And some of the students have sort of like in their discussion board commented like, oh, that's pretty cool that she took into account, does it help? I don't have no empirical proof. Do I hope? Sure.
Oh, I'm to the point where I think I'm going to make a Kaltura video and just explaining how important this is to my teaching.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
I'm just more curious, for Elizabeth, when you give them time in class to do the evaluation, do you still leave?
Oh yes, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
just more.
Yeah, no, I would definitely do that.
And you keep some of those thank you notes that you get for days when the process is so frustrating you wonder why you're here. And you just open that drawer with the thank you notes and go through them one at a time. It's a lifetime habit that really will help you a lot.
How many external and internal letters?
I think that depends on department. I had to submit 15. 15 names, and then with the hopes that that about 8 people would submit letters.
Both internal and external together?
Thank you, that's a good clarification. These were from other scholars, that I had 15 external scholars, and in the hopes that 8 of them would write a letter, because people are busy and so on and so forth. And then within the different categories, it was more like 3, for the other stuff.
And we had far less, but I forget the number now. But it was less than that. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
No wonder you had to save some of your collaborators.
It depends on your department, right? We had it's all external letters, right? They don't actually care about internal letters, it seems. And so it was all external. And I think I submitted 10 names. My peer committee actually, it was 8 to 10. And then my peer committee recommended some names. I actually got the opportunity to say, you probably shouldn't ask that person, they won't actually respond. And so they gave me a kind of period to do that a bit, but it's about 10 names. So,
So with regards to the external letters, Caroline, you mentioned talking to some potential writer and asking or sort of mentioning who might ask someone on this. Is it a standard practice to approach people, or is it something that's not?
I don't think you're supposed to, this is my perspective, my understanding is you're not really supposed to approach people, but I've had people come over and say to me things like, hey, I heard you're going up for tenure, feel free to put me on your list. Like, that's totally fine, those people you kind of want to hug. In the case with the phone call that I had, I felt like I owed this person an explanation why I was turning it down. But also another thing that I forgot to say, we've all been talking about networking with these people who are sort of above us, like the full professors and associate professors, but network with your friends and colleagues that are at your stage of life too, because I had, there was a group of 4 or 5 of us that met at conferences and we were all at sort of the same stage, and we would talk each other up to more senior levels of our department. Like, you know, in a good and positive way, but like if one of my friends published a paper that I thought would be of interest to one of my colleagues, I would have no problem saying like, oh, hey, check out this cool new paper from so-and-so, right? You're helping with disseminating work, but you're also helping, and then they help you too. So that's just another possible avenue. But what do you guys say about, like, I think you're not supposed to ask.
I don't think you're supposed to, but what you should do is you should talk to your people in your department and your peer committee and ask them, like, what type of letter writers they expect, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think because, you know, talking to friends or like colleagues at similar, some of them were a few years ahead of me. So they got tenure first at their institutions. I asked them to write me letters because they're now associate professors at those institutions, right? And they can be, you know, they should be, you know, if your peer committee considers them fine evaluators, and I think mostly they did, from what I can tell, right? You know, those are extra letters to that. But you really want to talk and see what they're looking for, right? I mean, mostly I would recommend not all full professors because it's just tough. It's just tough to get them, but again, it kind of depends on what your committee looks for.
There's also disciplinary transitions. Like right now in my discipline, the full professors are literally leaving, and everyone in my peer are between assistant and associate. So, like having that full professor, they're all retired at this point.
It's really hard. You know, this is me, and I have quirky personality. At a couple of the conferences that I was at in the year right before I went up for tenure, you know how you always, with your research, you're always saying next steps, right? So I used to have just a funny picture of something, and I would say, oh, and one of my next steps is I'm going to be applying for tenure next year. Like, shameless promotion. And then like 1 or 2 nice people would come up to me after conferences and be like, that's fantastic, congratulations. If you have to, you know, feel free to put me down on my list. And I was like, indeed, my friend. So.
And in the vein of shameless self-promotion, another tip I've heard is, you know, especially if you're starting out relatively new in your career, but also thinking ahead for full, is as you are writing an article, you know, a piece that you think is particularly good that you cited, you know, a senior colleague in your field, send them a piece and say, I thought you might like to see this, I cited your work, you know, I'm a big fan. You know, maybe do this regularly so they are alerted to your work, and then later on that they're somewhat familiar. Other questions?
So one of you kind of like mentioned that like stone letters should be from, it would be better if it would be from a land-grant university. What would be the situation if you are looking for an external letter from somewhere international?
So I guess the conversation I've had with my peer committee was that you and other folks is that you want to find letter writers that can understand what the tenure process is like here, right? At UMaine. I mean, literally at the University of Maine, right? And so if you feel like an international letter could speak to those aspects there, then I say fine, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I picked some of the letter writers I did was because they were at land grant institutions, you know, that had, I would say, above, you know, kind of caliber of like our program here, but at least they would understand some of the, you know, institutional, I would say challenges that exist at UMaine. I'm going to use the word challenges because, you know, or opportunities, and you know, or whatever you want to say. One way or the other, well, they have sort of an understanding, right? Because there's, you know, there's different levels, right? It could be different. You could get letters from, say, Ivy League schools or places that have a ton of resources, right? And they might not have, I'm thinking of the sciences, right? And they may have a different expectation level for what you would achieve during that period of time.
But on the flip side, I think those letters in balance can be good, because if someone looks at where we are and they're like, whoa, they accomplished that there,
Yep.
then that could be a really strong letter. And also, I did include an international letter because it can help speak to international reputation. So I think a balance.
You want to mix, essentially. You want to mix.
Yeah.
You want some that are all at all those different levels, I think.
I think that the land grant thing, the part of the reason that I mentioned that is also because a lot of us do research that we don't necessarily always publish it in the highest and best journals because we did it for stakeholders, right? We did it to like help with the service mission of the land grant University of Maine. And so to Will's point, people at other land grant institutions will understand that. They'll see that like you wrote an article for like the Maine Policy Review, right, which is published here on campus, that's intended for legislators. And they'll understand that took you time and that took you effort, and that you were doing that to be good for your stakeholders. And maybe that wasn't your like highest piece of work ever, but that was important part of your package too. So that's why I said that about land grant, is that my department told me those people will get me.
Yeah, as in my field, a lot of the scholarship is from England or the UK, and so I did reach out to a number of people in that field. And what I looked for was, people whose I could explain their work in a way that would be legible to my committee. So, this person had a book that was important in my field. So just being able to explain and make those connections was important. But then also to being mindful that their language for describing what we do might be different than ours here. So I had heard notoriously that people in the UK are much more standoffish and aloof in their descriptions. Like that the word competent there is a positive word, whereas here it tends to be more negative. So kind of being aware of that and seeing those letters more as additional letters maybe than my only letters.
Yeah, I was going to exactly say that. We did a workshop, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, where we were talking about interpreting peer committee letters or interpreting external letters. And we tend to use lots of superlatives here, right? And we'll say things like, this is very impressive, and we use lots of flowery language when we mean big things, where in international they might use very measured adjectives, if any, where it's just going to be, say this is competent, or this meets the criteria, where we'd be like, oh, that's a red flag. So just having some awareness of the peer committee when they're interpreting it, or higher up, that in whatever culture that represents, that's a good letter. You wouldn't want it to be a red flag because someone might misinterpret a cultural difference in language.
I was going to add, so I had 4 external letters, but then I had one, I forget what it was called, it's essentially like window dressing, but I had a superintendent write a letter on my behalf, and it spoke to our university practice partnership that we had. So it was sort of this additional letter that went on top of the external letters. I forget if that is, I don't know what that is, but it was considered sort of window dressing, and it added in some ways to the work that we try to do as a land grant.
And we were not allowed to do such letters, so I think it depends on department. We weren't allowed to do anything that had stakeholder, yeah.
So if I could summarize a little bit of what I've heard, University of Maine cares about you and wants you to succeed. As you keep updated with your CV and with the form for this process, you'll also remind yourself how much you've done. And you'll look at where you need to focus your efforts, but it's important to keep the thank you letters in a drawer and to remind yourself every now and then that this is going well, that you're taking steps, you're making progress, and you will get there with some help from your friends and from talking to your peer committee. And so don't let the process take you, and also remember to just say no. Every now and then you're allowed. You don't have to say yes to every service commitment in order to make it through the process. You do want to be engaged in service and go to conferences, because that's this life. The getting to know the people in your field and letting them help you shape your research is this life. And it really is a good life, though the work-life balance does somewhat remain a challenge, at least for me, my whole career. I love that the need to mindfully work on the work-life balance and to enjoy it as you go. UMaine really wants you to succeed. You know, that as a whole, we want you to keep you here. We want to keep you in Maine. We want to keep you at the University of Maine. And it's real easy to begin feeling in this process that we don't.
Thank you, Provost. And Rebecca.
What so in terms of external letter writers, what constitutes co-authorship at the level that they could potentially write a letter? So is it a particular chapter or journal come together? If somebody is an editor for a volume that you've written a chapter in, does that exclude them if they've written a different chapter in that same volume?
I personally, from being on a number of these and writing letters, etc., if there's any question, you just don't want to leave any question, really, is what it is. So if people start saying there's a conflict of interest potentially, then you get into a gray area. So I mean, clearly if you're a co-author, clearly if they've taught a class for you, advised you, there's been any kind of collaborative relationship, no. So it gets into gray area. If they were the editor and you were a book chapter, I would call that a collaborative relationship. But again, it's gray. So, yeah.
I mean, what I heard was the gold standard is you don't know the person at all, but we recognize that that's not usually the case. But that's the gold standard. Yeah. And then from there, just.
I've heard, have you had a beer with this person? And I'm like, so I don't know. There's no set thing beyond the collaborator. Collaborator, teacher, advisor. That beyond that, it's nebulous. Yeah. Right. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all.
Speaking of work,
Thank you.
I gotta move it over now.